"You'll never be anything," they laughed at dinner. That was the night they didn't even bother to whisper. My father, my stepmother, my siblings, they laughed like it was a family game. Forks clinking, glasses refilling. My presence? A ghost in uniform. "You were born to serve, not to lead," my brother chuckled, as if it was comedy night. Even my stepmother raised her wine glass like she was toasting my insignificance. My name is Jordan Reeves. And from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Because I need to ask you something personal. Have you ever sat at a table where everyone decided your value for you? Where they carved you into background noise while eating food you paid for? I sat there in my press shirt, the lines on my knuckles aching from drills, from push-ups, from days in the field they'd never survive. And all they saw was a woman in fatigues, not a fighter, not a strategist, not a leader, just a servant in olive green. The salt shaker was closer than my father's pride. He hadn't said a single word to me since I got deployed. Not one. But tonight, he cleared his throat and said, "Don't you think it's time to start thinking about a real job, Jordan? Something more stable?" My half-sister laughed like a hyena. She thinks she's G.I. Jane. I looked at the family photo wall behind them. Not one picture of me in uniform. Not one letter I mailed home framed. But there she was, my stepsister in her prom dress. My brother posing at some backyard barbecue like a CEO. They mocked me like I was invisible. So I got up quietly, took my plate to the sink, didn't say a word. Dad waved his fork in the air. "That's right, kid. Learn to clear the table. Might as well get good at what you were made for." I walked out without slamming a single door. But the next morning, at precisely 0700 hours, my father's boss, Mr. Holbrook, walked straight into the house. He was in full dress. The kind civilians don't recognize, but soldiers never forget. He stood at the doorway, looked directly at me, and snapped a salute. "Good morning, ma'am. Colonel Reeves of the 9th Army Unit. You ready for briefing?" The room froze. Forks dropped. Eyes widened. I turned around, slow and steady, the way commanders do when silence answers respect. I didn't smile. I just said, "Yes, Major. Let's begin." And my father's jaw was still hanging open when I shut the door behind me. The silence behind me as I left the house was louder than any battlefield I'd ever stood on. Because in that moment, my family didn't just see me. They saw what they'd missed. The truth was I had been promoted weeks ago. But I didn't tell anyone. Not out of secrecy. Out of exhaustion. What was the point of sharing good news with people who only celebrated what they could control? They ignored every medal I earned, called my deployments vacations, laughed when I saluted the flag, and said I was brainwashed. So I stopped offering pieces of my success for them to spit on. Major Holbrook drove us to the base. We didn't speak much, just exchanged a glance that meant more than words. At HQ, I walked past the row of new recruits standing at attention. Some looked no older than my younger cousins, but they saluted me with full respect. Not because I demanded it, but because I'd earned it. At my desk, 2 stacks of folders waited, mission reports, behavioral reviews, tactical approvals. And then a 3rd envelope. White. Personal. Stamped with the seal of the Defense Department. I opened it. Inside was the official offer. A national strategy post at Central Command. Permanent relocation. Full authority. 6 figures. Security clearance at the highest level. All the things I was told I'd never be good enough to reach, delivered in ink and signature. That night, I stood in my office alone. The wind outside rattled the blinds. The base was quiet, except for the soft hum of the AC and distant boots on concrete. I looked at my reflection in the window. Not the little girl who used to be told to sit still and smile. Not the teen they said was too bossy or too intense. Not the woman laughed at for skipping family brunches for field training. I saw a soldier, a leader, a woman who never needed validation to define her worth. And I remembered something my drill sergeant once told me when I broke a 3-minute silence record in the freezing rain. "Ma'am, people will call you cold when you don't flinch. That's because they've only ever survived by screaming." The next day, my brother texted, "Dad won't stop talking about yesterday. He wants to invite you to dinner." I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled up the draft email I'd written months ago. Subject: ownership transfer. Attached: the house deed, the car title, and a brief message. "You laughed when I served. Now you can serve yourselves. I'm no longer your landlord or your backup plan." And I hit send. 2 hours after I sent that email, the phone rang 5 times in a row. Dad. Then my brother. Then a blocked number, probably mom using someone else's phone. I didn't pick up. Not out of anger. Out of choice. They had spent years treating my silence like weakness. Now they were learning what it really meant. The house they lived in? Mine. Bought in cash when I returned from my second deployment. Renovated it myself. Paid every bill. Even added a ramp for Dad's bad knee. And not once did they say, "Thank you." They called it a family home, but it was only family when it benefited them. When I needed a room after surgery, they told me the guest room was already taken by my brother's girlfriend, the same one who told me, "Combat boots don't look feminine." When I asked for a little quiet during recovery, "You're acting dramatic," Mom said. "Everyone's tired." But I still cooked, still cleaned, still paid the $1,600 electric bill that ran their air conditioners 24/7 while I sweated in the basement. After the deed transfer was processed, I made 2 calls. One to my lawyer, one to the new tenant. Yes, tenant. I had listed the house for lease through the military's relocation assistance program weeks earlier. A fellow veteran family needed housing. Badly. A mother with 3 kids and a husband recently paralyzed in service. She cried on the phone when I told her she could move in by the end of the month, first 3 months rent-free, utilities covered. Her voice broke. "Why would you do this for strangers?" And I told her, "Because we're not strangers. We've just never been introduced." That weekend, I drove past the old neighborhood. Their cars were still parked outside. The same American flag I hung years ago was still waving on the porch, faded now. I didn't stop, just watched from across the street. Then I saw Dad step out in his robe, confused as a moving truck rolled in behind him. I didn't wave. I just sat there, quiet, as the new family arrived. And when my father caught my eye across the street, I rolled the window down and said 6 calm words. "You said I'd never be anything." He didn't respond. He just stared, like a man watching the final piece fall into place, and realizing he built it wrong. That same night, I checked into a quiet lakefront cabin. No service, no traffic, just the soft lull of water and wind. I needed the silence, but not for the reasons they thought. Not to cry, not to sulk, but to breathe. Because for the first time in over a decade, I wasn't carrying them anymore. No more picking up after their mess. No more solving problems they created. No more, "You're just overreacting," when I set boundaries. The next morning, I finally opened the letter my old commander had mailed weeks ago. Inside, a photo of me standing before my unit, soaked in desert sweat, arms crossed, eyes steady. And on the back, just one handwritten line. "Some earn rank, some become it." I stared at it for a long time. Because that was the real difference, wasn't it? My family believed titles gave you power. But what they never understood was that integrity gave you legacy. And I'd rather be respected in silence than praised in pretense. My phone lit up when I returned to service. Missed calls, 14. Messages, 9 voicemails. Dad's most recent text? "We didn't know. If you had told us, we would have acted differently." I laughed. Because that's what they always did. Waited until I had something they could brag about. They didn't want me. They wanted a version of me they could parade at parties. "Look at our daughter. She's a colonel." Not. We ridiculed her until she left. The kicker? They started showing up at military events. Distant ones. Fundraisers. Community forums. One night, a young recruit pulled me aside and whispered, "Ma'am, is it true? Your parents were the ones who laughed at your career?" I looked him in the eye and replied, "What matters is who's laughing now." He nodded like I had given him permission to protect his own fire. But the real twist? 2 weeks later, my name was submitted, without my knowledge, for the Veterans Leadership Honor Roll by Major Heartbreak himself. He told me, "Not for your medals, not for your missions, but for surviving a battlefield no one trains us for, the one where your own people are the enemy." The night I got the call confirming I was accepted, I stood at the window with no one to tell. And I realized that was the reward. No more needing applause. No more begging for validation. Just peace. Earned peace. The night of the ceremony, I didn't invite my family, not out of spite, but because I didn't want to share that space with anyone who saw me as less than. This honor wasn't for show. It was for the girls who got told they were too aggressive. For the women who were told, "Know your place." For every soul who walked into a room and got sized down before they even opened their mouth. I walked in wearing my full dress uniform, chest high, boots polished, medals aligned. The announcer didn't read my resume like a list, he told my story. How I built logistics systems that saved lives overseas. How I trained over 300 soldiers. How I turned silence into strategy and shame into fuel. The crowd stood, and I stood still, because I had learned something powerful. When you own your story, no one else can weaponize it. But just as I stepped off the stage, a voice I hadn't heard in months called from the aisle. "Jordan." I turned. It was my stepmother, wearing her best pearls, holding her phone like she was filming. Behind her, my father, awkward in a suit 2 sizes too tight, and my half-sister, visibly annoyed that people weren't staring at her. Stepmom rushed forward. "We just wanted to say we're proud of you." I stared for a second, then smiled politely. "Of what part?" I asked. They blinked. The medals? The speech? The leadership? They said nothing. Exactly. Because what they really loved was the platform. The now. The spotlight. Not the years of being mocked. Not the decades of silence. Not the day I came home bleeding and no one picked me up from the airport. I leaned in, soft and slow. "You're at the wrong party. This isn't for guests. It's for witnesses." And I walked away. Back in my seat, I received a photo from the base's media team. It was from earlier that evening, me standing alone in the hallway, reading a card pinned to the memorial wall. A quote beneath the names of fallen women soldiers. She led not by command, but by character. I closed my eyes. That was the real inheritance. Not a last name, not approval, but legacy. A few rows back, I saw my family leave early. Maybe they were hoping someone would ask about them. No one did, because in this space, they were just people in the crowd. And I was the reason the room stood still. A week after the ceremony, I got a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual letter in my father's handwriting. That alone was rare enough to make me sit down. "Jordan, we may not have always seen eye to eye. Maybe we didn't understand what you were really doing, but you've made something of yourself. And we're proud now." I stopped reading, because right there, in that clumsy sentence, was the entire problem. Now they were proud. After the accolades. After the camera flashes. After other people clapped. But where were they when I collapsed from heat exhaustion after training in 110-degree weather? Where were they when I got passed over for promotion the first time and cried alone in my barracks? Where were they when I came home early from Afghanistan, not because the mission was over, but because one of my soldiers died in my arms? Their love had terms. Their pride had a timestamp. And I was no longer interested in earning approval that came with a delay. That weekend, I visited the home I'd given to the veteran family. The kids had painted the front steps. Red, white, and blue, with tiny handprints at the edges. Inside, the paralyzed father had built a custom ramp and gym from scrap parts. The mother had turned the old guest room into a resource center for military wives in crisis. She hugged me and whispered, "It didn't just give us a house. You gave us a chance." And I realized something. This was my family now. Not by blood, but by battle. That night, I hosted a small dinner at my new place near the lake. 12 people came, all from different units, backgrounds, struggles. Every single one had once been underestimated. Every single one had risen anyway. There was no head of the table. No toast about promotions. Just a single note on each plate. You were never hard to love. Just too strong for weak hearts. We raised our glasses in silence. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt home. Back at base the next day, I passed a group of recruits. One whispered, "That's her, Colonel Reeves." Another asked, "What's she like?" The first replied, "She doesn't talk much. But when she does, people listen." And I smiled. Because that's all I ever wanted. Not noise. Not fame. Just impact. A month later, I received an invitation. From my parents. Gold trim. Formal. Embossed with their names. "Come home. Let's reconnect." It was for a family reunion. They were hosting it at the same country club that once told me I didn't meet the dress code. The same place where, years ago, my brother toasted his wife's promotion while I was seated near the exit. I almost tossed it in the trash. But something stopped me. Not curiosity. Not kindness. Closure. When I arrived, heads turned. Not because I made an entrance, but because I wasn't supposed to be that woman. Sleek black pantsuit. Hair tied back with sharp elegance. A name badge clipped neatly. Colonel Jordan Reeves. They watched me cross the marble floor like I didn't belong in the script they wrote. Mom stood at the center, wearing pearls again. Dad beside her, drink in hand. "Jordan," she said, smiling too wide. "You look different." I nodded. "So, does the scenery." Dinner was served. I wasn't seated at the gift table this time. I wasn't even seated. Because after dessert, I stepped forward. The event organizer, not knowing the family tension, invited me to speak as one of our most accomplished. I walked to the mic, looked out at faces I used to shrink beneath, and said, "They told me I was born to serve, not to lead. So I served. And through service, I learned how to lead, not by inheritance, but by fire." A hush fell over the room. I didn't look at Mom or Dad. I looked at the young girl near the corner, my niece, maybe 14, who had spent the night watching everyone with big, quiet eyes. And I said, "If they ever laugh at your dream, remember, they laughed at mine too. But the difference between a joke and a legacy is who writes the ending." The room stayed silent. No clapping. No coughing. Just stunned stillness. And I stepped off the stage. Later, my sister found me near the coat room. She looked pale. "They're embarrassed, you know," she said. "You didn't have to do all that." I zipped up my jacket. Neither did they. I left early. Not because I was unwelcome, but because I'd already outgrown the space and they finally realized it. Driving home, I glanced at my reflection in the rear view. Not bitter. Not broken. Just free. And it looked good on me. 3 weeks later, I got an email from Dad. Subject line, "Just talk to us." It was short, clumsy. The kind of message you send when the silence becomes heavier than the argument. "We're trying to understand. Maybe we made mistakes. Maybe we didn't treat you fairly. But we were scared. You were always so strong. We didn't know how to connect." I read it once, then again, then closed my laptop. Because now they wanted connection. Now they wanted understanding. But where was that energy when they laughed during dinner and told me I was born to serve? Where was that trying when I came home with torn ligaments and they asked if I could still mow the lawn? I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud. Temporary. This was calm. Final. Like a soldier, sheathing a weapon that never needs to be drawn again. The Veterans Leadership Council asked me to lead a new initiative, not just for returning officers, but for those re-entering broken families, toxic homes, or no homes at all. I accepted. And on the first day of the pilot program, I stood in a circle with 11 other veterans, some older, some younger. One had a service dog. One wore sunglasses indoors to hide a black eye, not from war, but from home. We shared quietly. And when it was my turn, I simply said, "They told me I wasn't born to lead, but they were wrong. I just wasn't raised to believe it." And one by one people nodded, because they knew. They'd lived it too. Weeks later, I sat on the porch of my lakefront cabin, coffee in hand, watching a group of women from the program laugh and fish together. One of them waved, beaming. She'd just received her first job offer in years. I waved back, not with pride, but with peace. Because I'd built something no one could take away now, not a title, not a medal, not even a house. I'd built respect, earned, not given, lived, not claimed. Then came a knock. It was my niece, the same one who sat quietly at the reunion, the only one who never laughed at me. She handed me a small box. Inside, a silver plaque, engraved with the words, "Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you refuse to repeat." She said, "I told my friends about you. You're the reason I applied to West Point." Tears burned my eyes. But I didn't cry. I just stood, placed the plaque beside my medals, and said, "Then let's make sure the next generation never has to earn their worth twice."